right, we are ready to start. Thank you for joining and welcome everybody to our demo webinar on double materiality. Good afternoon to those of you that are in Europe. Good morning to those that are following from the other side of the ocean. My name is Donato Calace and I am the Director of Accounts and Innovation at Datamaran. And today I will talk about double materiality in a very practical demo webinar to you. So a few housekeeping rules before we start. First, if you want to ask me questions, please use the chat box in your tools bar for Zoom. I will be happy to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Then if you want to engage with us on social media, we have a couple of handles for you. And if you have troubles with Zoom, please contact our marketing teams. So before engaging on the subject of double materiality, I'd like you to involve you on a quick poll. And this poll is actually asking you what you think is double materiality, and if you are familiar with the concept. I'm launching the poll now, so we'll allow a few seconds for you to answer. What is interesting is that we ran the same poll about 2 months ago when we had the non-financial reporting directive webinar, and so I'm very curious to see if there are actually any differences in the opinion of the people following us. And all right, results are coming in. I'll allow 5 more seconds just to complete it. And let's see the results. All right, interesting. We have 36% of you is actually familiar with the concept of double materiality. So that's a way better results than what we had last time that we ran the poll, where just 5% of the people knew what double materiality is. So today I'm gonna cover very quickly conceptually what is double materiality, in particular where the concept is coming from, how it has been introduced, but really focusing on the practical implications. So what is changing for companies, and how double materiality can be used to take better decisions. So before exploring that, I know that many of you are already familiar with the concept of materiality, but some are also newcomers in the space. So it's always useful to have a quick review of what is materiality. In particular, because if you have this in mind as a representation of materiality, as what materiality is, this is wrong. Materiality is not a matrix visualization. That's only its visualization. There's much more to materiality than just the visualization that goes in the report. And actually, my favorite definition of materiality is the following: materiality is accounting best kept secret, and it was written by Brennan and Gray. But let's try to unveil a bit what is behind this secret. Materiality analysis is about, 1, gathering evidence from different sources to make informed and credible materiality judgments, especially because ultimately boards are accountable for what is material, and it's their role to make the materiality judgment. So it's important to have credible and verifiable sources to base the judgment upon. Then the second point is that materiality is based on the juxtaposition of an internal company view versus an external stakeholder-oriented view, because that sort of analysis will give you actually the perspective of how much you're aligned with the system of values that surrounds your business. And then third point, very important, again, materiality is not about the visualization you put on the report. Of course, the analysis of material issues is helpful to set the boundaries of your reporting activity, but its purpose goes beyond that. is actually about organizing and generating information that is relevant for decision making, goal setting, stakeholder engagement, and risk management. So with this clear, if you want to go deeper, of course, this is a quick overview of what is materiality. There are a number of sources that you can explore, and I will share this presentation with you, so you will be able to geek out on materiality if you want. Then with this covered, what about double materiality? Was it really necessary? Where is this coming from? Is this just an additional burden for reporters, or is it actually useful? And again, if you think that double materiality is this, then no, you're wrong. So double materiality was introduced by the recently launched guidelines to the non-financial reporting directive. Again, those guidelines are non-binding, but the EU Commission is also in the process of reviewing the non-financial reporting directive in the next 6 to 12 months. And it's very likely that the direction it will take will follow actually what is covered in those guidelines. And this is actually the visualization that comes from the non-binding guidelines. And it portrays two perspectives of materiality. One is called financial materiality, and it's important to understand the company's development, performance, and position. And as you can see from the graph, it really depicts how a topic impact the company. And in particular, as you can read from the note below, is impacting in the sense of affecting the value of the company, not necessarily the financial measures that are in the financial statements. And the other perspective is environmental and social materiality. So this perspective is really the perspective of the activities that the company is performing, how they impact the environmental and social sphere that the company is in relation with. It's also interesting to see the different audiences that are addressed by the two materiality perspective. Of course, financial materiality is more relevant to investors, whereas the broader array of stakeholders that includes consumers, civil society, employees, and investors, it's covered by environmental and social materiality. As you can see from this side of the visualization, the non-financial reporting directive covers both perspectives. But one thing that is very important is that the two dimensions of materiality are not separate, are not parallel, but actually they are very much interlinked. And the same text of the non-binding guidelines specify these elements, clarifying that these two risk perspectives already overlap and are increasingly likely to do so in the future. The positive and negative impacts of company on climate, for example, as a topic, will increasingly translate into business opportunities and or risks that are financially material. So if you have followed, for example, the recent debate between SASB and GRI from what is the perspective that it's dominant, financial materiality versus environmental and social materiality, the directive here is specifying that the two perspectives are very much interlinked. So we shouldn't be looking at them as parallel to separate, completely different words. But let's go in more detail, and let's look at what the non-binding guidelines are actually indicating. First of all, they specify that, in effect, the non-financial reporting directive has a double materiality perspective. So the double materiality concept is already in force. It's not something that will be included in the next revision of the directive or in next regulations. It's already how the directive should be interpreted. Then, from the side of financial materiality, again, the perspective is understanding what topics affect the value of a company. Very important here is that the guidelines specify that this perspective is typically of most interest to investors. So again, thinking to what I said at the beginning, that materiality is really about identifying sources that allow to gather evidence on why a specific topic is material, let's keep this in mind. Financial materiality is about what is of interest for investors. So it is more likely to find a representation of financial materiality in those documents that are addressing investors, like, for example, financial statements or financial reports. Then same rational, same kind of process for the environmental and social perspective. So the environmental and social perspective is about really understanding the external impacts of the company, and the perspective is that of a broader array of stakeholders, including citizens, consumers, employees, business partners, and so on. Final point, which is also very important, is that companies are in charge. So in no way the guidelines are setting a normative list of issues that are indicated as material, but the position is that the companies, and in particular the board, are in charge of defining what topics are material and from what perspective. So it's very important then, in order to make informed decision and to have a robust strategy, being able to justify why a specific topic is material and from what perspective is material. Again, thinking to the first point, which is about gathering evidence and analyzing sources, demonstrating that the material judgments are sound. This part covers a bit the conceptual explanation behind double materiality. But now, really, how can we represent it? How can we have a representation of double materiality? So the remaining part of the webinar will be actually addressing it, and I will show you a demo on how to do it with Datamaran. In particular, we talked about sources before, and our approach is data-driven in the sense that we analyze those sources to infer and to present evidence that a specific topic is material. We analyze in particular 4 sources: corporate reports, mandatory regulation, voluntary initiatives and guidelines, and online media, including online news, websites, and analysis of Twitter. Those sources represent different stakeholder groups. Remember, we mentioned investors, we mentioned the global society. Analyzing those sources allows to gather that information that should inform materiality judgments. But let's make this practical and jump in the presentation, in the platform. So this is Datamaran. For those that are not familiar with our system, Datamaran is a cloud-based platform which uses natural language processing, a branch of artificial intelligence, to analyze unstructured data in the form of text, narrative, commentary around non-financial issues across the sources that I mentioned before. Those sources are represented in different modules of the platform. So we analyze corporate reports in our benchmark module. We analyze regulations in our regulatory module. We analyze Twitter in our social module. We analyze global news sources in our news module. But I'm going to focus on materiality for this demo, which is the app that actually gathers the evidence from all the data sets to build a data-driven materiality analysis. The system is loading. I can see that some questions are coming in already, and I'll make sure there is enough time to cover those questions just at the end of the demo. So as you can see, this is the getting started page of the materiality application. And for the purpose of this demo, I actually built 2 materiality scenarios that are based on the pharma industry. So the first is financial materiality, and the second is environmental and social materiality for the pharma industry. Of course, the key insights of having the 2 perspectives built in is to compare the 2 perspectives and see what we can learn by comparing the 2 perspectives. And we have a comparison functionality that allows us to do that. But before going there, I think it's also interesting to see what is the methodology that I used to to build a financial materiality analysis for pharma. Of course, this is one of the ways that is possible to portray materiality, but essentially the approach is based on the logic that I explained before. If financial materiality is really about understanding what is of interest for investors, regulators, and auditors, then we are more likely to find evidence of those topics in the sources that are addressing them. So for this reason, for example, what I'm looking at to derive evidence of financial materiality is the analysis of all the reports published by companies operating in the biotechnology and pharma sector across the globe. All the information that they publish in their annual financial reports and SEC filings. As you can see, my group, my sample group includes 218 companies. Plus, another source that is of interest in this scenario is, of course, regulation. And in this case, I'm focusing only on regulations that is sector specific and with disclosure requirements. The other sources that Datamaran presents, news and social media, we're not setting parameters for those in this case because we really want to focus only on what is financially material. So let's have a look at the results. The first output is, of course, the matrix visualization. But then more interesting than that is the scorecard showing the relevant scores for the issues that we want to assess. And those issues are listed in the first column. So what you can see here is a collection of around 28 different issues, including some sector-specific issues like access to medicine, antimicrobial stewardship. Those issues are actually structured in subtopics. So, for example, access to medicine includes the topic access to medicine and responsible pricing as well. If we look at human rights, then a number of subtopics are also included here: human rights, forced labor, and so on. The way the topics can be clustered into higher level teams is completely customizable. So what I'm looking at is just a default representation of it. Then the rest of the methodology to identify material issues is rather straightforward. Every issue is scored across our data set. So as I mentioned before, the analysis of financial statements, the analysis of mandatory regulation, and then voluntary regulation, news, and social media. But in this case, as I'm trying to portray financial materiality, I'm not putting any weight on voluntary regulation, on news, and social media, because those sources represent the different categories of stakeholders. Again, financial materiality is really about investors primarily, and then regulators and auditors. And those stakeholders are represented by the first two columns that we analyzed. That's why 50% of the weight of the analysis is on the first column and 50% is on the second column. Then, if we compare it to what I built for the environmental and social materiality, so we have a different perspective. It's loading the result. You can see that the parameters that I included for the analysis are different, meaning that I'm analyzing sustainability reports this time instead of financial reports. And then also, again, mandatory regulation, voluntary regulation, news, and social media. But this time, voluntary regulation, news, and social media have some weight included to it. So they are included in the analysis. So what we can do now is really look at the differences in the results and try to understand how comparing the two perspective of materialities can be insightful from the perspective of a company. So to do that, let's go back to our main page and let's launch our comparison functionality. So in this case, I'm gonna compare the results of our financial materiality versus our environmental and social materiality. As you can see, the two rankings of issues are quite different. So what we are comparing now is the overall results. So on one side, the results of financial reports plus mandatory sector-specific regulation, which is represented in the financial materiality. Whereas on the right-hand side, we're comparing the results of the environmental and social materiality perspective, where we are taking into account a broader perspective of sources. Then it seems that we had a quick technical difficulty, so we're back online now. So I was actually mentioning the differences in the results on the overall results of the rankings. So on one side, in financial materiality, we can see that the top 5 topics are product responsibility, ethics and compliance, innovation, digitalization, clinical trials, customer responsibility, and access to medicine. And those are very different from the environmental and social materiality perspective. We can also filter for those that have the bigger differences. So we can see that from a financial materiality perspective, there are a number of topics that are very different from the environmental and social one. Look, for example, climate change and air quality, competitive pressure, customer responsibility as well. We can also deep dive into the different sources that we are analyzing, comparing specifically the disclosures in sustainability report versus the disclosures in financial reports. And this analysis is quite telling because you can actually see what are the top topics that are disclosed in financial statements versus those that are mentioned primarily in sustainability reports. And that gives a very different perspective of what is important for the sector. Look, for example, how innovation and digitalization is way more important from a financial materiality perspective. You can also see on the right-hand side what are the different topics that are mapped to this issue, just to understand better what is the nature of the issue. Also, there are some topics that have more or less the same value, for example, pollution, and others that have a very different ranking. So well-being, health and safety is disclosed much more in sustainability report rather than financial reports, for example. Then this analysis in terms of insights allows to actually understand better what is the nature of the issues. So what are the issues that are more relevant to an investor audience? And those are, of course, in the first column, whereas what are the issues that are more relevant to a broader stakeholder kind of audience and are more likely to be addressed in sustainability reports. But also what, in terms of decision-making processes, the two perspectives allow also for different stakeholder engagement tactics and strategies. the issues that you have on the first column are the issues that you should engage with with your investors primarily, but also are mostly of interest for the management teams, for the board, for the executive teams, because those have an impact on the bottom line. Those issues are relevant from the activity that the company is performing, and are of interest for a broader array of stakeholders. So those can be useful for engagement with NGOs, for example, or unions, or employee groups as well. That also have important impact in terms of what are the goals that you should set for the different issues. Given that we are reaching top of the hour, I will now address your questions. Hopefully, this quick representation of what double materiality is and how it can be represented was useful. So let's see what are the questions that you are indicating. So an attendee is asking why the non-binding guidelines are not binding. So in this case, it's part of the policy development of the regulation. So the non-financial reporting directive, which is the mandatory piece of the regulation, has not changed yet. The Commission has plans to change it. But at the moment, they only issued those guidelines. So those guidelines are actually the best indication of where the future of the non-financial reporting directive can go. And again, they also clarify what is the perspective that the non-financial reporting directive has now. And as I explained, double materiality is already reflected in it. So it's not something that is waiting to be implemented. So another question is about impacts, how to include impacts in a materiality assessment performed with Datamaran. That's a very good question. We have some advanced filters that actually look at, for example, which regulations have penalties or sanctions attached to it. So that might represent, for example, some legal implications or financial impacts. We can filter for those news that are associated to legal disputes or trials, or also scandals. So if you want to characterize those topics with more impact on the company, there are ways to explore that kind of information. That being said, covering external impacts, that is a different level of analysis. So we keep our system open, allowing uploading custom data. So if our user on their side have, for example, life cycle assessment of impacts or other kind of impact assessment analysis, they can upload the data and represent it into the analysis. I can see that there are other questions coming. So this question is about the climate change in particular, because the non-binding guidelines were showing climate impacts on the company. So the idea was to capture the spirit of that double materiality perspective. The non-binding guidelines to the non-financial reporting directive focus on climate because they're seeking more alignment with the TCFD, but that approach can be actually applied to all the different kind of topics. The second part of the question is about how analyzing financial reports is actually portraying impacts on the company. So the kind of analysis that we're building is an analysis that in a way represents materiality, double materiality. So financial materiality is the foundation. The idea is that comparing sustainability reports versus financial reports allow us to infer what kind of topics are more likely to be included in financial reports, and topics are included in financial reports because may have a material impact that is of interest for investors. A company won't mention a topic without in their financial statements unless it's of interest for regulators, for auditors, and for investors. So that is the kind of perspective that Datamaran is currently capturing, and is a first step to represent double materiality. I can see that there are no further questions coming up, and we reached top of the hour with our demo. I hope that the webinar was interesting, and as I mentioned, it's a starting point to see an application of this concept of double materiality. Then, of course, I'm happy to explore with you in more detail how double materiality can be represented and what are the implications for the company and how it can be best portrayed in your analysis. So don't hesitate to reach out and connect with me about double materiality. That being said, wishing all of you pleasant rest of the day, and until next time.